I just hope after all that it is fascinating. Thank you very much. Well, we are now going to be talking about something different. We've been talking about Article 12 quite a lot, but I think while we are going to be talking about a different article, I think we'll find that there are quite a few similar themes that will come out of the discussions. And I think one of the issues that strikes me is that we don't have all the answers by any means to how this is actually going to work out. And I think what is actually wonderful is that we do, I think what the convention does is it gives us a vision of what we're trying to achieve, and does sort of set out a framework for how we should go about that, but sadly does not give us in any way all the answers. So I'm hoping that there will be some questions about Article 19 at the same sort of level and intensity as perhaps Article 12. And I think what's really important is that we should all work together to try and work out how we go about ensuring that people do have the right to live and participate in the community, which is what Article 19 is all about. Before I start looking at Article 19, I just wanted to explain what I mean by community living, because I tend to use the term right to community living, which to my mind Article 19 encapsulates that. But the concept of community living has been around far longer than the convention, and so this is a description that has been developed by people with disabilities, and then, as you'll see, it was put in the European Coalition for Community Living, a focus on Article 19. And you'll see we said people with disabilities are able to live in their local communities as equal citizens with the support that they need to participate in everyday life. This includes living in their own homes or with their families, going to work, going to school, and taking part in community activities. So that's really what community living is about. And as I said, Article 19 encapsulates that concept of community living. So what I'm planning to do, and I'm going to have to do it very quickly because I've promised Charles that I'm going to finish by 3, but we'll see how I go. So we're going to be talking about Article 19, first of all. I want to do sort of look at that in a bit more detail. Then I want to look at, I've talked about community living. And so what does that mean, and why does it matter? And why does it matter to all of us? And I think that's a really important point that I want to stress. Then I'm going to talk about institutionalisation and then deinstitutionalisation, which even for an English speaker, that word is difficult to say, but actually it's also even more difficult to do. But within Europe, we still have a major problem with a huge number of people being placed in institutions. So that is something, certainly from the region I come from, it's really important, and we need to look at what Article 19 says about that and how it can help us to move from a prevalence of institutionalisation to enabling people with disabilities to live in the community. Then I want to say a little bit about myths and misconceptions, and some of them might be very familiar to you in terms of what we talked about in relation to Article 12, but as I said, I want to sort of identify a few of those. Then, subject to time, I want to talk about action to implement Article 19, and then again perhaps say a few words about looking forward and sort of really acknowledging the growing influence of the CRPD generally, but also think about how that might help us to move to ensure that people with disabilities can live and participate in the community. So this is Article 19, and it's in some ways it's very similar to other articles in the convention. So you've got the initial point, which is really crucial, to say that states parties to the convention recognise the equal right of all persons with disabilities to live in the community with choices equal to others, and shall take effective and appropriate measures to facilitate full enjoyment by persons with disabilities of this right and their full inclusion and participation in the community. So that's the right, and then the article then sets out sort of 3 areas in which states need to take action in order to ensure that people with disabilities can exercise this right. So just sort of looking at that in a bit more detail, I think one of the things I want to stress is the equal right of disabled people to live in the community with choices equal to others. So this is not something that is unique to people with disabilities. It's saying that, you know, we, as part of our, if you like, our human condition, is that we live in the community and we participate in community life. And what this article is doing is to address the fact that for many people with disabilities, this is the right that, while others take it for granted that they have this right, it's not a right that many people with disabilities can enjoy. So this is an important right to all of us. But it's particularly important to people with disabilities because it's a right that is denied to them. So you've got this strong statement about the right, and then the Article 19 states what needs to happen in relation to action by states parties to ensure that this right can be fulfilled. And what we're looking at is sort of three areas. So first of all, ensuring that people can have full enjoyment of this right, then full inclusion and participation in the community. And therefore, I think that's one of the points that's really important to remember. It's not simply, and this is something that happens when people talk about institutionalisation, it's not simply about where someone lives. It's about enabling people to live in the community and participate in community life as others do. And the three main areas that states need to look at are the equal opportunity to choose where and with whom to live. And today, this afternoon is a session that's focusing on choice, so that's obviously of crucial importance to the session, but it's absolutely essential to people being able to enjoy the right to community living. Then there's an access to a range of community support services. That's really going to be very important to ensure that people can live in the community and also participate in the community. And then thirdly, equal access to mainstream services. So it's not simply about support services, it's saying that people with disabilities should have the right to enjoy services that are available to other non-disabled citizens. Another theme that I think you sort of think that hopefully the discussions will pick up on is this idea that when we're looking at the convention, there's this interconnectedness between the articles. As I think Rosemary was saying, you can't just focus on one, say Article 12. It's very much linked to Article 19. And so therefore you won't be surprised to hear that I'm saying Article 19 is very much linked to Article 12. But there's also other articles, Article 14, the right to liberty. We've been hearing about people being involuntarily admitted into institutions, and in fact, basically, they are deprived of their liberty. Article 26 talks about the right to habilitation and rehabilitation, and that is obviously very crucial in relation to access to community support services. And then access to mainstream services, Article 9, which focuses on accessibility services, then that's really crucial to ensuring that people with disabilities can make use of services that are for the whole population. Another point that you will quite often hear about in terms of the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is the fact that there are no new rights in this convention. And that is true, but I think one of the points about Article 19 is that this is the first time that an international human rights treaty has referred to the right to community living. There are UN documents and Council of Europe documents that refer to the importance of people with disabilities being able to live and participate in the community. I've given you two examples on the slide, one from the UN, United Nations. This is from the Standard Rules on Equalisation of Opportunities for Persons with Disabilities, which says persons with disabilities are members of society and have the right to remain within their local communities. They should receive the support they need within ordinary structures of education, health, employment and social services. The Council of Europe, we've got the European Social Charter, the revised charter in 1996, Article 15 talks about the rights of persons with disabilities to independent social integration and participation in the life of the community. So that's quite a long way towards the right to community living. And then the Disability Action Plan, encouraging member states to focus on enhancing community living, enabling people with disabilities to live as independently as possible, to make choices on how and where they live. So just sort of thinking through some of these points. Why does it matter? Well, the first thing is, if you think why it matters, is it's about what, this is who we are. As individuals, we need to have somewhere to live. Most of us would prefer to have a home rather than just somewhere we have as somewhere to go to at night. We want to have somewhere we feel is ours, is safe, with people that we love. What we do, work, leisure, who we spend time with, developing friendships, social networks, civic engagement, voting, even standing for election. These are things that most people take for granted, but those people who are not enabled to live in the community and participate in the community do not have this ability. Those people are in institutions, are isolated, they have not got a choice about where they live, they haven't got an opportunity to work, and the idea of them voting is probably something that is a million miles away from those people who are providing so-called care in the institutions. So this is why it matters. It's because actually this is really about us, as individuals, as human beings. These are important to all of us. But a little bit more about why it matters. I think one of the things about Article 19 is that it really sort of makes very clear about how important all of these aspects of life are to all of us. I mean, some of us might choose not to engage with some of them, but together these are the things that we make us human, make us part of a society, and this connection with others is really, really important. And another aspect, which again I think was picked up at Article 12 discussions, was this realisation that we all need support to realise our aspirations and fulfil our potential. I don't think there will be one person in this room who would be able to put their hand up and say, I did it all on my own. We all need support. It's just sort of different types of support, but in order to really fulfil our lives and to achieve what we want to achieve, we look to other people to help us, and we help them. But that's something I think that Article 19 really does sort of set out in a really very powerful way. And I've got a quote from the former Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, Thomas Hammerberg, who said, Article 19 of the CRPD embodies a positive philosophy which is about enabling people to live their lives to their fullest within society. So, turning a little bit more to Article 19 and looking at community living, it has been, for those of us working around the issues around deinstitutionalisation, has been a really important advocacy tool. And because what it does is it confirms that community living is a human right. It's not something that governments can do because they're being nice to us. It's something that we all have a right to as human beings. It also underpins policy objectives that certainly within Europe are set out both by the European Union, by the Council of Europe, and also by national governments. All sort of talk about the importance of promoting social inclusion and challenging discrimination. This Article 19 is really underpinning all of that and saying, yes, that this is the right way forward, but actually it's a right that governments have to respect. It's not about, as I said, governments doing a favour to their citizens. This is a right that governments need to ensure people can enjoy. And for me, what it does, it really highlights the gap between that rhetoric of the policy and the reality. There was a report that came out in 2007. It was deinstitutionalisation and community living, outcomes and costs, shortened to debt clock, which is not better. But basically, the report was a very, very powerful one in that, it first of all, as you'll see here, it states that over 1 million people across Europe were in institutions, and they tried to get information about facilities that 30 or more people were placed in, and they came to a figure of I think 1.2, their estimate. But that was probably an underestimate because a number of countries didn't collect that kind of information. So you've got the number of people who are in institutions, and then I'm sure, have seen, many of us, all of us have seen the countless reports about the human rights abuses in institutions, how horrific many the living conditions are, how people are treated. And this is still going on in the 21st century. So again, Article 19 is really challenging that and saying this is not acceptable. And also, if you look at research around the institutionalisation and people sort of considering what is the best form of care, so-called, this is not, the research and reports are saying this is not an acceptable form of care. It's incompatible with the right to community living. And then I've just sort of given you, the next point is really sort of flagging up a piece of work that I was involved in. It's like looking at the structural funds are European Union money that are given to governments, and the report was highlighting the fact that these monies are being used to maintain institutions rather than develop the community-based alternatives. And we argued that not only was that against EU law, but it's also against the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now, the next slide, I'm just looking at some of the barriers to community living, and again, we've discussed some of those. Guardianship, the huge issue in relation to Article 12, but it's also a major issue in relation to Article 19, because people who've been appointed guardians can agree to the person who's subject to guardianship to go into institutions. And as we heard this morning, in some cases, then that's not considered to be involuntary admission because the guardian has agreed to the person going into the institution. Another barrier to equal choice on living arrangements is in some cases there are very few, if any, alternatives to institutionalisation. So the choice, if you can call it that, is either being placed in an institution or being with your family, but the family does not have any support, and that is often why the person ends up in an institution. There's another issue that quite often people talk about is the issue around choice, and perhaps people choose to go into an institution, but I think if there's nothing as an alternative, I don't think that could be then to be described as a choice. There's also issues about people being able to being given an opportunity of making a decision and understanding what the alternative is. As I said, if there isn't an alternative, then there isn't much of a choice. But also, if people are then quite often you'll hear, well, you've got an institution, but a number of residents want to stay in that institution. Well, there might be good reasons for that, because that is perhaps the place that they've known all their lives, and they don't, it's quite scary to move. So there would be an issue, I think that raises issues about ensuring that people know what the alternatives are, have the information conveyed to them in a way that they understand, and have an opportunity of making real choices. So I think that in itself is a huge issue. Moving to access to community services, as I just said, there are in many countries a lack of community-based services. Then often when you start to talk about, well, how could we make things different, you then find that the legal and financial structures are huge barriers to developing the alternatives. One example might be that those who want to develop the alternatives are non-governmental organisations, but then the law says that they can't provide services. So you then have to start getting into the intricacies of looking at how services are financed and what are the blocks to alternatives being developed. And then the third area that I've been talking about, the equal access to mainstream services. Quite often, and again, we heard this morning, Elizabeth talking about sort of services not being accessible to people with disabilities. You might also find that people are the law says people with disabilities can't actually use a service. So these are issues that would need to be looked at in relation to Article 19, but you can see that they also pick up on other articles in relation to the Convention. So I've already mentioned institutionalisation, again, sort of thinking through some of the points that have been made about Article 12, and you think, well, that has some resonance with Article 19. I think Rosemary talked about, when she talked about guardianship yesterday, saying guardianship's not mentioned in Article 12. Institutions aren't mentioned in Article 19. But if you look at the way Article 19 is drafted, you will see that although it doesn't say, you can't have institutions, an institution is never going to meet the requirements of Article 19. And I would say that institutionalisation is an anathema to community living. And again, I've got a quote from the Commissioner for Human Rights, in which he said, "People in many countries are confined to institutions and therefore segregated from the community. In institutions, they are at risk of exploitation, violence and abuse. Countless more people with disabilities are physically located in their communities, but barred from meaningful participation in the life of their communities, because either services are not available or communities are organised in ways that exclude them from participation." So what do we need to do to address institutionalisation? First of all, look at Article 19, and you'll see there's a clear obligation to develop community-based alternatives to institutional care. And that's something that other treaty bodies have made comments on. I've mentioned Article 15 of the European Social Charter already, but the Council of Europe have talked about the need for governments having national strategies, and these strategies are necessary in order to work out how you're going to transfer from institutions to the community and ensuring that former residents can live and participate in the community. So that gets me on to some sort of myths and misconceptions. We heard earlier the sort of issues around isolation, and this is something I think is really, really important about Article 19, because while it promotes independence, it in no way is it about isolation. If you look at Article 19, yes, it's about people living in a community, but it's also about enabling people to participate in community life, and that's a real it must happen under Article 19. It's not about placing people in communities that they're unfamiliar with and not giving them any support to engage in community life. And that then the next bit is it's not just about the physical environment. And this is something that I think sometimes in debates around deinstitutionalisation we find that there's taking up a huge amount of time talking about, well, the size of the facilities, is a 50-bedded unit okay? And this I think it is important to think about the number of people living together, but it's actually about enabling people to live together when they've chosen to who they want to live with, and it's also enabling people who are in the community to then think about what services that they might need to support them, say, into going to work, going to engage in leisure activities, and to do things that all of us expect to be able to do as part of our day-to-day life. So this is something, a point that was made by there's a committee in the UK, government, the Joint Committee on Human Rights. It looked at Article 19, the report was published last year, and you'll see this, that the nature of support is key. Does it enable the person to live the life that they choose and to be included in their community? That is the issue that needs to be looked at, not, let's have a debate about how big or small the actual facility needs to be. And deinstitutionalisation is only a factor, and again, I'm sort of in danger of repeating myself, but the Fundamental Rights Agency published its report on independent living, having talked to quite a few people about independent living, and its report commented on this issue, saying, for persons to have choice and control over their lives, they should be, for example, allowed to vote in elections and stand for public office, facilitated to work through reasonable adjustments in the workplace, and allowed to enter legally binding contracts. So you can see that Article 19 is far broader than where the person lives, and you can also see how it connects with other aspects of the Convention. So thinking about the implementation of the Article 19, so first of all, states need to recognise the right of people with disabilities to live in the community. Then they need to take effective and appropriate measures to facilitate this full enjoyment of the right, with choices equal to others. And they also need to take effective and appropriate measures to facilitate people with disabilities' full participation and inclusion in the community. Again, linking this to other aspects of the Convention, raising awareness about the Convention, which is something that Article 8 talks about. We need to think about what is the Convention, is it translated into the national language, do people understand the rights that are set out in the Convention. When we're thinking about taking action to implement Article 19, how are we engaging with people with disabilities? What are governments doing to ensure that involvement is real rather than something that's sort of part of a tick box concept? We need to look at the national laws. As I was saying, there could be legal barriers to the move from institutionalisation to community-based services. We need to look at what laws might be setting up a barrier, and we also need to ensure, again, that review involves people with disabilities. And then look at the national monitoring that's going to be looked at tomorrow, but that again is going to be something that will be very important in relation to ensuring that Article 19 is being implemented. The people with disabilities, how are these being monitored? Are people with disabilities being involved in that monitoring process? Then I'd just to move on to the concept of progressive realisation. And I think sometimes I happen to think this is a really, really important and crucial concept, but quite often I feel that people think it's a weak point. What I would say is that when we're looking at the Convention, and there's the debate about civil and political rights, economic, social and cultural rights, and how they might differ, I think when you look at these different articles, you'll see that a lot of them, and Article 19 I would say is one of them, where these rights are contained in one article. And what's important to my mind is to say, there will be some rights that very few states have achieved, and I think Article 19 is one of them. And what is important is that states are taking very clear, concrete action to realise the particular right. And that is not an excuse to do nothing. I think that's where it's really important. What progressive realisation is doing is recognising that some rights may take some time to realise fully, and some states may have more resources than others. So it's recognising that this needs to be looked at in a kind of country-specific way. But whatever the state of the resources, what needs to happen is first of all, say, the recognition of the right to community living, and then an action plan to show what the state is doing and when it's going to do it, and how it's going to ensure that it keeps within its timetable to move forward to achieve this, or to realise this right to Article 19, right to community living. So the lack of resources is not an excuse. All states should be showing what they're doing to realise Article 19, and they need to move as quickly and as effectively as they can. And that's, I think, where issues such as the Article 33, the monitoring of the implementation of the CRPD is going to be so important. And again, engaging people with disabilities who are saying to governments, okay, here's Article 19, this is what we should be aiming for. We need to ensure that you are moving as quickly as you can towards that, and we will keep an eye on you, and we will want to be involved in what you're doing, what policies and legislation you're developing, what services you're developing, and we will ensure that you are moving towards this goal in a proper and effective way. In the meantime, also, there are certain things that states cannot do, and that's that the progressive realisation does not allow discrimination. So the right to protection from discrimination takes immediate effect. So, as I said, I think it is a very powerful tool that can be used very effectively in these kind of rights when there's a recognition that it will take some time to achieve the common goal. And this is particularly important when you're talking about countries where the predominant form of care is in institutions. So we need to ensure that there's positive action to move from institutionalisation to the development of and realisation of services in the community. So, I've got 5 minutes. So thinking about action to promote community living, as I said, you need to have an explicit recognition of that right. We need to have concrete and targeted action, looking at areas of non-compliance, how you're going to address that, show how and when the required action is going to be taken, a community living plan that is really sort of setting out how the government is going to work towards closing institutions and having community-based alternatives. And then, as I said, the establishment for participation is going to be absolutely crucial to this process. And I've got here additional funding that goes back to progressive realisation. So a recognition that some states will have less resources than others. But if, as in some of the European Union countries, the member states of the European Union, they then have access to additional funding, then they should be using that to develop community-based services, and if they use money to maintain the institutions, that, to my mind, goes completely against the CRPD in any event, but it also is regressive and progressive. What we talk about progressive realisation, moving towards a goal, using additional money to maintain institutions, is going against that move forward to the goal, and therefore that is why, one of the reasons why I would say the use of structural funds to maintain institutions is contrary to the CRPD. So there's been quite a bit of work around, well, how can we help governments to move towards community-based services? Given I've got very little time, I just recommend that if you're interested in this area, do have a look at the Common European Guidelines, which were produced for the European Commission the end of last year, that sets out some various areas that governments should be looking at to sort of ensure that they're moving from institutional care to community-based services. For example, one chapter looks at making the case for developing community-based alternatives. So it's really sort of setting out why governments need to take this shift from institutional care to community-based services. So we've got the prevalence. We've got the policies all say about social inclusion, so they've all signed up to this as a concept, so they should be sort of then working towards achieving social inclusion. I've mentioned human rights abuse violations, but also there's a huge amount of research that shows how damaging institutionalisation is to not only children but also to adults. And quite frankly, if governments need any more reasons to persuade them to move from institutions to community-based services is actually a better use of resources to enable people to live and work, live and participate in the community. In the next slide I'm going to skip because it's just, again, it's sort of work that I was involved in for the Open Society Mental Health Initiative, looking at a checklist for Article 19, sort of things that would need to be looked at when making that transition to institutions to community-based services. And I've sort of set out, the importance of developing a national strategy. That's going to be absolutely key, but again, I would emphasise that needs to be developed with people with disabilities, as well as professionals who are, look at what kind of services that has to be negotiated and discussed with people with disabilities. Lawyers will need to be involved in terms of looking at the developing of the legal framework. People who know about financing will need to be involved. So it's quite a complex process. So starting off with the national strategy of thinking what you want to achieve and how you're going to go about achieving that is really important. But it is absolutely essential that is work that is developed with people with disabilities. This slide is also talking about the review of legislation, which, for the sake of keeping time, I will skip. Just finally, last two slides, I just wanted to mention that we focus on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is absolutely right. But I thought you'd be interested to be aware that this really is beginning to have an influence in. I'm based in England, and there are a number of cases that the courts are being asked to look at the CRPD when interpreting the European Convention on Human Rights. So there have been a couple of cases in which the courts in England have done that, have made some very important comments about recognising the status of the CRPD. And then there was an absolutely crucial case before the European Court of Human Rights, Law in Switzerland in 2009, when the court talked about the convention and talked about its importance. And you'll see it said there is a European and worldwide consensus on the need to protect people with disabilities from discriminatory treatment, and then referred to the CRPD. So it's gaining ground, and I think when looking at it, I think it's really helpful to start looking at how other courts in other jurisdictions are looking at the CRPD and seeing how influential it is, and seeing how it should aid their interpretation of their domestic laws, or in the case of the European Court, the European Convention. And that leads me to my final slide. There was a really very, very important case in 2012 in Stanislav in Bulgaria. And this was a case that concerned a man who'd been placed in a social care home, it was an appalling institution. The Committee on the Prevention of Torture had already been there and said how appalling the conditions were, and very little, if nothing, had been done to address those. The court found that Mr. Stanis' right to Article 5 had been breached, also that he had his right, Article 3 is the freedom from torture and inhuman, degrading treatment and punishment. His right under Article 3 had been violated, and Article 6, also the right to fair trial, had been violated. What the court did not do was look at Article 8, and Article 8 is a really important article under the European Convention. It's the right to private and family life. And the court felt that the issues that Mr. Stanislav had raised, in relation to Article 8, it felt that all the issues had been adequately covered when it looked at these other rights, which I've just said had the court held to be violated. But I think that's a real shame, because I think there's a great connection between Article 8 of the European Convention, the right to private life, family and private life, and also the fact that people are still being placed in institutions, often because there are there are insufficient alternatives. And this is a minority. I've got a quote from the partly dissenting opinion. The judges agreed with the other violations, but were saying they felt that Article 8 should have been looked at because it did raise additional issues that weren't covered under the other articles that had been held by the court to be violated. And I'm an optimist, so I'm hoping that this might be a little sort of, the door is beginning to be opened where the European Court might start to look at issues relating to community living and perhaps start looking at Article 19. We'll see what the two judges said. They said, considered the case raised separate Article 8 issues. Having to live in the pastor's social care home had effectively barred him from taking part in community life and from developing relations with persons of his choosing. The authorities had not attempted to find alternative therapeutic solutions in the community or to take measures that were less restrictive of his personal liberty, with the result that he had developed institutionalization syndrome, that is, the loss of social skills and individual personality traits. It seemed to me that, as I said, I am an optimist, and I really do hope that if these cases come to the European Court in the future, the whole of the court will start to look at these issues, because this is what it's about. It's the fact that people are being denied their right to community living. And I hope that I've covered enough to perhaps have some discussion later, but I think I need to finish. So, thank you very much.